recording. All right. So this is our second half of chapter 7. And Stephanie, you missed the first half of chapter 7. So you missed all of our discussion about the relationship between sin and evil the other day. So, all right. So in this half, which starts on page 153, basically Migliore is dealing with the fall of humanity. So, and then at the end, and actually the questions I sent you, I chopped off the last question I meant to send, which was about how Jesus, what role Jesus plays in reconciling all us. So we deal with all the questions of how we're separated and alienated from God and one another. And then I forgot to include the question, or it got chopped off, about Christ reconciling us. So anyway. Well, anyway, Migliore opens this section with two sort of definitions of sin. And do either of you feel willing, able, and ready to define what? And mind you, he sort of, as he goes through, like he's done with other stuff, he keeps sort of unpacking sin more. But the first two definitions are sort of really related to sort of classic understandings. So who would like to try to tackle those?
What are, like, which words are we defining?
What's that?
Which words are we defining?
So he, in chapter 7, with two definitions of sin, he sort of opens like with two sort of what we would say, how he would define what sin is.
One of them is sin can be described as the resistance to our essential relation to God and our need of God's grace. And then it says sin is fundamentally opposition to grace.
Right. And so that's the where I would say the second one of the two definitions. So if you go up before you get to that,
Yeah, it says it's the depth of human intolerance for difference.
exactly. So and actually that notion of sin there is really, if you think about part of the problem the church is in today and how we treat other people, intolerance is hugely problematic in religious institutions across the board, regardless of whether they're Christian or not. But there's a great deal of intolerance in religious institutions. And so one of the challenges Migliore is pointing out there is that notion of intolerance is really one of the primary locuses of sin, if you will. And I think even though we might say these are definitions, they could also be considered sort of locus or loci. So places where we locate sin. And so intolerance can be a place that we might say we locate sin. The second one that you described, though, or lift up about sort of our resistance to God's grace or opposition to grace. Can you unpack that, or Carly, can you unpack that a little more on what Migliore is trying to drive at there?
he describes it as just saying no over and over again, sort of. So like you're rejecting your relationship with God, sorry, you're rejecting your gift from God to be filled with grace and all this other stuff. Um, but I personally feel like it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Well, okay.
Like, I think then, while it's sort of a rebellion in this sense, so he's saying that it's like um, kind of like a governmental thing. It's the law, but okay, no, take voting, because voting's a privilege, not a right. So it's like you have the gift of voting, but people are like, no, I'm not going to do that um, because of the principle of the thing, or because of who's running, or whatever else, to kind of make a point. And so people do kind of the same thing with sin and grace, and they sin because they feel like either they don't deserve the grace and so they sin more, or excuse me, they feel like it's not really a thing anyway, and so they sin. And it's kind of hard to explain, but it's more of rejecting the principle of having that grace, or the principle of God as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also would say that because grace obviously is a free gift that we get from God, there's no, we talk about it being unmerited or unwarranted grace. There's nothing we can do personally to uh, receive that. And so it's also in a way sort of like, if you look at in human interactions, when someone just comes up to you and offers you a compliment, or gives you, or like a month or so ago, I mean, this is sort of just a random example, but Mindy and I went to dinner somewhere, and we were in, like, because we were doing a drive-through thing, and we got up to the window, and I got my money out to pay for it, and the person, the sales, the checkout cashier person said, "Oh, the gentleman in the vehicle in front of you paid for your dinner." That's kind of like the way grace is. Now, obviously, we had no way to reject that really, but he didn't have to do that. We weren't deserving of it. It was just his real kindness to do that. And so that's the kind of way that grace functions for us. Um, the difference is, because we have free will, we have the capacity or ability, if we want to, not accept it, right? Um, and so I think you're right that Migliore is, I mean, rebellion is probably a better word, because it really is a rebellious kind of act to stand against that. Um, and when you do that, you're not only, you are in a way denying God too. Or maybe not the existence of God, but at least the power of God. You're attempting to deny it. Um, all right. Carly, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I was pretty much in agreement, like with what Stephanie was saying.
All right. So connected to the second um, definition of sin that you lifted up, Stephanie, there, Migliore makes this statement: thus we misunderstand the depth of sin. How is it that we misunderstand the depth of sin, and why is this an important distinction that Migliore makes?
What I got from it was him saying that basically we're taking it in a general context of it making us like bad or doing something wrong, when the distinction really is that we're like disrupting the relationship with God, if that makes sense.
Yeah, were you going to say something, Stephanie?
Something similar. I was just going to say, in terms of what Migliore is saying, it's like it's that separation from God. So it runs a lot deeper than just like, oh, I have no example. All of a sudden, my first thought was, oh, you slapped your mom, but that's not really. Um, I mean, that's sinning. So it's not just this surface level. I did something bad. Let's move on. It's a lot. It's it's worse than that. It's deeper than that. It runs deeper in your soul than that. And I think that's what he's trying to say in terms of your relationship with God.
Well, and so one of the things that we do is that we tend often to equate sin with just bad behavior, right? We tend to equate sin with mistakes that we make, or the mistreatment of other people, or those kind of things. And while Migliore is making the point that those are problematic, those damage our relationships, that this fundamentally creates a, a chasm between us and God. And that's deeper than just bad behavior. And so I think one of the things that he's trying to lift up here is the issue that many Christians, or the trap, not issue, the trap many Christians fall in, when they just equate sin to the bad things they do. And the classic sort of Catholic motto, you go to confession, you confess the bad things you did for the week, and life is all good. And Migliore, if you've created a chasm with God, just giving a list of the bad things you did is not going to, it's not going to fill up that chasm enough to bridge it, right? Or to fill it in so it doesn't exist anymore. And so his point is that we often just look at sin on the superficial level of bad acts. And I think that's a fair point. Even the most um, the least religious Christian uh, tends to think about the things that they do wrong as being sin, and they just sort of attributed that, and they don't really take into account the sort of deep rift that can be created between humans and God. And that rift is really the fundamental problem. And I think Migliore, although he doesn't really say it here, that rift, that chasm that we create with God, if it doesn't get bridged, if it doesn't get filled in, or somehow made smaller, uh, will continue to grow. And that ultimately, that's the sort of uh, biggest problem. I mean, that's the real consequence of our sin, is that. And all the bad acts in the world don't really equal up to that. And so, um, my sort of take on it is the sort of perfectionist model of Christianity, where we sort of have a checklist of the good things we do and the bad things we do, and we try to always have more good things than bad things, right? Well, that doesn't equate for what Migliore is talking about either, because that doesn't really deal with that deeper rift between, or alienation from God. And so, but a lot of us like to fall in that trap. Well, I've done 10 good things this week and only 6 bad things, so I'm okay, right? Or the people around me are okay. All right. What are the two expressions or forms sin can take when we rightly understand sin to be a disruption of our relationship with God?
Um, he says sin is pride,
Uh-huh.
but it's self-centered idolatry. But then it goes on later and it says self-hatred, self-negation, and self-loss.
Right. So those are the two forms. So what he's talking about there, and this is sort of the um, most of Christian history, most of the church's history, most of theological history, any of that is focused on the sin of pride, right? We hear a lot of people talk about the sin of pride. We hear a lot of people talk about how self-centered idolatry, in modern day lingo, narcissism, that's the biggest problem. And it is a sin, and we know that it's a sin that creates this chasm with God. But the second part of the self-hatred, or sort of self-loathing, which is a passive sort of activity, that's been sort of under the radar, if you will, or covered up because of classic theology's focus on the sin of pride. And it's really only been in the late 20th century where liberation theologians, feminist theologians have lifted this up as a point of contention and saying that for most people that are oppressed in the world or that are subjugated, the sin of pride is not really the dominant sin. The sin of self-hatred or the sin of self-loathing is really the greatest sin, and that's the sin that has been sort of overlooked by most of classic theology. And I think it's a fair statement. Both of you are women, so you probably can speak better to this than I can as sort of a white male. But did that resonate with you when Migliore lifted that up, or the sort of feminist critique around it? Yeah, no, maybe.
It didn't really process with me, is that I was kind of reading and I was like, okay. And so yeah, not really, but sort of.
Well, I mean, I guess have either of you, maybe not personally, but have either of you sort of encountered in friendships or family relationships where people that's really their greatest challenge is their sort of own self-loathing or self-hatred, and certainly it doesn't have to only be women or persons that are subjugated. I mean, there are lots of men that might have that too. But I think, again, the sort of LGBTQI community has certainly, we've seen this, as a predominant problem in that community where people that are gay or lesbian or bi, transgender have so much self-hatred, right? All right. And basically the next question there is really the feminist and liberation theologians' critique. So it's right at the bottom of page 155 and then the top of 156, and they say an adequate doctrine of sin will recognize that sin against the grace of God is not only the Titanic Luciferian rebellion, but also the timid, obsequious refusal to dare to be fully human by God's grace. And that's that second type of sin. And I think one of the things that the feminist and liberation theologians have pointed out is that for most marginalized persons, to feel like they're really included in God's grace is the biggest challenge they have, and to feel like they're created in God's image. I mean, we get back to this question all the time of who's created in God's image, and back to Sally McFaig. And if you continue to talk about God as a man or male gender language, and then you have images of Jesus as being white or blue-eyed or these kind of things. All of these kind of things, even if they seem subtle and not that important, dehumanize people that don't look like that, right? And don't experience that sort of sense of God. And they can't really connect to being created in the image of God. I mean, I think, Stephanie, to what you were saying the other day when you were having your conversation with your roommate about being created in the image of God, and sort of your roommate sort of saying, no, God's a man kind of thing. Well, how does that work for 50% of the world's population then, right?
Yeah, and I think another big part of especially the subjugated or marginalized people is like in terms of the Christians that are really prideful in general, like it's often people being like, well, you're making a mistake, you're this, you're that, we're essentially the perfect ones. Obviously, this isn't what they say to the people's faces, but they're like so proud of who they are as Christians or who they are as people that they just ignore kind of everyone else and act like everyone else is the problem. And so that makes the people who are marginalized feel even worse and feel like they can't have that connection with God because they aren't the, excuse me, the wasps, if you will, that are kind of controlling everything.
Right. All right. What are the dual forms sin takes in relations to others, meaning other humans? What are the dual forms that sin takes?
Domination and servility,
Yeah,
and then self.
yeah. And so, what is Migliore pointing to there?
I feel like part of it is what I was just talking about.
What's the dog
And
doing?
yeah, I was yelling at the dog. He likes to try to bite the other one, but um I feel like part of it is what I was saying. So it's like the will to power, but also less obvious slide into powerlessness, kind of passivity, self dissipation, diffuseness, triviality, lethargy, and fear of initiative. So it's like you can either be the one drastic extreme or another in your sin and be like this super powerful and like dominating, um submissive and small, and yeah.
Carly?
I'm gonna be honest. I can't agree or disagree because it went over my head.
All right. So,
So if you can explain it better.
well, okay. So Migliore's what he's driving at here is that basically when in relationship to other people. So we always need to remember that sin is on a two-dimensional plane. Okay, so there's the sin so the vertical dimension, that's the sin or the relationship with God, and that can be damaged by what we were talking about earlier. And then there's the horizontal plane, which is the relationship between human beings. Um, and so Migliore is making the point that that can be damaged fundamentally in one of two ways. It can either be damaged by sort of the act of domination. So people and the classic example of this obviously is slavery. That's the first model of domination. But that's not the only, and it's not probably the most lasting or the most enduring. The most enduring model of domination is really second class citizenship of women, right? I mean, that's the most enduring model of domination we really have, is that in every society, except for the Amazons, um, and every society and culture, basically, with the exception of a few, women are always second class citizens, right? And they're somehow playing a role over and against, or that is controlled by men in their realm or sphere. And so men therefore have a dominant sort of position over women. Then that also plays out in sort of class and in ethnicity and those kind of things. So there's domination in class structure, more wealthy people over less wealthy, and so forth and so forth. Uh, but then there's the second part of the sort of servant or passive sort of role, and that is where Ruther again, and this is sort of plays back into the feminist critique, is that the second sort of type of sin that comes forward is the sin that where people, you know, um, women in particular, or other people's passivity towards men or other people. And that creates a problem. And it sort of, and so that functional relationship gets damaged that way. So we can create this chasm between human beings, either sort of by dominating one group of humans or humans dominating another, or people that are always stuck in this passive role and not being able to relate on a sort of equal or mutual basis. And that creates a structural sin as well. And so I think here, one of the things that Migliore would lift up is this is the kind of structural sin that we see created in societies, that it's really hard to overcome, and we're often oblivious to it. I mean, you know, it's hard today in North American society for the average person to admit that they might have some structural advantage in life just because of who they are over other people, right? That's really hard for people to admit. But we know it's true, and therefore we know that that creates a sort of type of sin in our relationships. All right. Is that helpful, Carly?
Yes.
All right. All right. Migliore says, what does the sin of denial of human destiny look like according to Migliore?
He says it's kind of like people resigning to the situations and just kind of taking a not really hands off, but like hands up, sort of like surrendering to the world, be it poverty, war, etc., and just kind of saying tomorrow's going to be the same way. So just don't worry about it. And like, so people don't really want to change their lives. They don't really want to do anything that will actively better anything. So they just kind of sit.
Yeah, and here I think he's Migliore's thinking about a couple things in particular. One, he's thinking about sort of problems in society that we fail to or don't seem to be have any interest in working on fixing, right? So our general apathy towards problems in society. So whatever they might be, that's one thing. But he's also clearly talking about a general apathy in our own life. And so there, you know, if you believe, you know, that part of your being created in God's image means that you have a purpose, right? That there is some purpose that your life has been set on some trajectory, that your sort of unwillingness to participate in that purpose and just let the world sort of, you know, just go with the flow, if you will. And how many people do we know in the world that are just comfortable going with the flow and not sort of rocking the boat, not making any effort to get out of their own way? You think that all the terms we use uh, about people's unwillingness to change their life or to better their own life is exactly what Migliore is talking about. And so we become defeatist, right? We just give in to the world's, you know, my life's never going to get better. Things aren't going to change for me, you know, and we resign ourselves to, you know, being living in a crappy environment. You know, the classic example I can think of, which is really part of it, gets back to the second issue there, the domination and passivity, is women that get trapped in abusive relationships. And how many times do we see that women become, and I'm not blaming them, don't take it that I'm blaming the women, but they become resigned to the fact that there's no hope for them to get out of that situation, right? And they just allow it, and therefore they become unwitting participants in their own self-destruction because they don't have the capacity or desire to break out of that kind of relationship. Even when people try to help them, they can't do it. And so, I think this is a huge problem in our society that we've, and if you look at the structural problems of racism or climate change or these other big sort of societal problems, we face a lot of apathy towards those too, as well, right? And lots of Christian churches don't seem interested in tackling these problems. I mean, I can't count now the number of times, Stephanie, you've been frustrated in Hebrew prophets when you see how much the scriptures tell us to care for oppressed people and feed people and do these kind of things, and yet we continue to ignore it as Christians, right? I mean, that may not be the resignation so much that he's talking about here, but it's certainly an avoidance of trying to deal with those problems. All right. So Migliore how does Migliore define the doctrine of original sin? Well, first of all, go ahead, Carly.
He says original sin is radical and universal, so it affects every part of human life and it affects all human beings.
Right. And so what does that mean for him? Because he makes a clear statement that what original sin is not.
It's not a theory of the origin of sin, but the claim that the whole of humanity finds itself in a condition or state of captivity to sin.
Yeah. And so when you hear the term original sin, either of you, what do you all think of immediately?
Adam and Eve.
Yeah. And what about Adam and Eve?
They essentially committed the original sin and then messed it up for everybody else.
Yeah. And Carly, when you hear the term original sin, what do you think?
I mean, I'm with Stephanie. I think of Adam and Eve and, eating the apple.
Yeah. Well, just to remind folks that we don't know what the fruit was that Eve ate. We think the reason we say it's an apple is because of those great Renaissance painters from the European Renaissance that painted an apple, and that was it. But we don't actually know because the Bible doesn't tell us the fruit. And actually biblical scholars today think it was more likely a pomegranate, if anything. So apples have gotten a bad rap in all these centuries for maybe no reason. But both of you at some point in your life had some sort of connection or like relationship to Catholicism. And for the Catholic Church, what has original sin historically meant? Aside from its connection to Adam and Eve.
I think it's passed down generation to generation. So the original sin wasn't on Jesus. It skipped him essentially, but then that's what causes everyone else to sin and mess up, and childbirth, etc., and all the things, all the punishments that came with Adam and Eve are kind of how we're having to live now.
All right. So yeah, the crucial point you're missing is that sex is the problem here. So it is passed down from one generation to another.
Is it gender or
no, sex,
intercourse,
copulation, the sex between a man and a woman? That's the crucial sort of point. So basically, the historic classic sort of view of original sin is that Eve caused Adam to sin. I mean, again, the woman gets the blame for, so she was tempted by the snake. They wanted to become like God. That was the whole reason of eating this fruit from the tree, was to become like God. And then, so the implication is that childbirth happens after this, okay? So they have children after this sin takes place and after they're cast out of the garden. And if you remember the story, in the early part of Genesis, God says that to Eve, that are you all still there?
Yes.
Yeah, but your Wi-Fi is still kind
Yeah.
of.
Wow, that was crazy. All right. So back to the story. So anyway, so childbirth was going to be painful and all of this kind of stuff. So basically, classic theology said that through sexual intercourse, the sin was passed from one generation to the next. Okay. So your point about Jesus is correct in one sense, but you miss the notion about Mary. And Mary, I think we talked about this, is actually the Immaculate Conception. Jesus is not the Immaculate Conception. Mary is. And and what that means is that Mary's birth happened through a process of this intervention of the Holy Spirit. And so, therefore, she wasn't tainted by original sin, which is why she was able to then be the mother of God, because she didn't have the taint of original sin. So, and then Jesus, because Jesus was the product of, the incarnation, again, he wasn't tainted, he wasn't touched by the sin, but he wasn't touched by the sin because his mother was pure as well. And so that's the part about Jesus in there, is that Mary had to be pure in order. And so for basically 16, 17 centuries of theology, this was the dominant theological position. And even into the 20th century, it continues to be dominant in some categories. And so Migliore here is changing the dynamic of that whole concept and moving it away from this notion of being passed through, from one generation to another through sexual interaction or intercourse, and making it connected to all humanity. And that's what the original sin is, that it covers all humans because of the act that happened at the, in that time frame. Does that make sense? Do you see how Migliore is sort of reframing of that? I mean, obviously he's not the only one, but his reframing changes the idea of original sin there, and makes it less sort of connected to human flesh, if you will, and why that might be important. Do you see why that's an important notion? All right. What are the three paradoxes that Migliore outlines?
The first one is sin is a universal condition, but it is also a self-chosen act for which we are responsible.
Yeah, so what's he mean by that?
Sin is inevitable but not necessary. So
Yeah.
like it's your life,
Thank you, Augustine.
yeah. So like you have, or it's part of your life, but you don't have to commit sin.
Or I'm sorry, that was Niebuhr, that wasn't Augustine. Niebuhr's picking up Augustine. Yeah, but I think that one thing that he's driving at here is that some people, because the notion of original sin being universal, right? Sort of act and behave that it's just present, and so they don't have to take any personal responsibility. And so Migliore wants us to understand that just because it exists doesn't mean that we have to uh, allow it to rule our life, right? So we have a responsibility to stand against sin. That's really what he's driving at. And so Niebuhr in that really pithy statement is saying that yes, it's always going to be there, and at some point you're going to fall into the trap of sin, but you have a responsibility to stand against it, and therefore it doesn't have to rule your life, first of all, and secondly, you can actively work against it, and so it won't necessarily uh, it doesn't have to be part of your life either in terms of you know um, controlling how you behave and live in the world. All right, what's the second paradox?
Sin insinuates itself into all human action, including not only what is widely condemned as evil, but also what is commonly praised as good. So, like, it's kind of everything, and like what we've interpreted as good, pleasurable, desirable, etc. It's still a sin, but it kind of disguises itself, and I guess would be considered more of a temptation and stuff. So, but it's still interpreted as good. But the last line is deep down, man is not only executioner, not only victim, not only spectator. Excuse me, he is all three at once. So with that, it's essentially like you're participating in all of these things kind of willingly, but also unwillingly. And it's all complicated. Sorry about the noise behind me.
That's all right. Yeah, and so one of the things is, it, again, you can escape it as the first thing, you know, escape it in the sense it doesn't have to dictate your life. But even when you're behaving in a good fashion, sin still permeates goodness, right? And so you are never ever totally outside of the realm of sin in the human condition. I mean, one of the things that we need to be clear about is that this is all predicated on the fact that we're stuck in this human condition at the moment. And part of what we're trying to do is release from the human condition, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose of Christ, is to restore us back to our state of utter goodness, if you will. But here, even the good acts that we do are enmeshed in a sinful world. And so, sometimes I think that, another way to look at this is that we can do good things, but there are sometimes unintended consequences, even to our good actions, that can lead to problems down the road. And that's a way I sort of think about it. You do some kind of kind act for a person that's in suffering or homeless or whatever, and with part of the money you give them, they buy food, but the other part of the money they go and buy drugs, right? I mean, you were giving them money to buy food, and part of the unintended consequence of that is that they still participate in their use of drugs, and that was not your purpose or reason for giving them money. um, and so in that sense, that's how this sort of executioner model that he's talking about there at the end, and Elie Wiesel is lifting up, takes place, is that we still play a role in these kind of things, even if we're unwitting in our role. All right, what's the third paradox?
Sin is a corruption of the individual person, but it is also active and powerful in public and corporate structures of life.
So what's that sort of notion there that he's pointing at?
It's kind of like this is up to the individual person, but it's still kind of interwoven with everything. So take systemic racism, for example. It's deep rooted in the government, in the society, etc., but it's still up to the individual person to participate in it. So I think that's what it means. But then further, like to say that it's the individual person, it's kind of like what we've been talking about in Hebrew prophets with the new covenant, and how the like people aren't being punished for someone else's sin now. It's on them, like whatever sins they commit, it's their fault, it's their punishment, etc. So it's solely based excuse me, it's solely based on the individual rather than everyone.
Yeah, well, part of it, by the way, the book that Migliore references by Reinhold Niebuhr there, Moral Man and Immoral Society, even though it was written a long time ago now, I forget the exact date, it's actually a great book. I mean, part of the reason he's referencing it here is because it deals directly with this point. And what Niebuhr, the basic argument that Niebuhr makes in that book is that individual human beings can be moral, okay? But society itself is always going to be corrupt or immoral. Um, and what Niebuhr is saying there is that an individual person can tell you the truth, okay? So I can tell you, Stephanie, the truth. Carly, I can tell you the truth. But when we become a collective, so a society, the capacity for us to tell the truth in that context becomes not impossible, but highly unlikely. And so society is more likely to be immoral than individual persons. And so part of the reason this is an important thing, and this book in particular is important, I had forgotten about this, but when Billy Graham first came to prominence in the 1950s, Niebuhr critiqued Billy Graham in a series of, this is the day when theologians actually wrote op-ed pieces for the New York Times and things like that. And Niebuhr wrote a series of op-ed pieces for the New York Times. I think it was, or maybe it was Newsweek. But anyway, he wrote a series of op-ed pieces, basically critiquing the type of Christianity that Billy Graham was lifting up, and that being this sort of individualistic, personal piety, because what Niebuhr saw that leading to was ultimately, a very individualized, private sort of relational, all vertical sort of relationship with God. And he wasn't wrong in his critique, although back then Niebuhr was sort of looked at as sort of being cynical or, not really. So there was a lot of backlash against Niebuhr for his critique of Billy Graham. But he's making that critique plays out here that yes, you can have individual people as good, but that when they get into society, they're going to behave immorally. And the reason Niebuhr makes that argument is that in covenantal relationship with one person, you can hold people accountable, but it's much more difficult to do that as a large, on society. And so Stephanie, your point about the sort of what's going on in Hebrew prophets is well taken here, because the accountability level is more difficult at a societal level. And you look at our current political state in the United States, and certainly you can see this to be clearly true in our current political state, that it's very difficult to hold, groups of people accountable, right? I mean, that's especially accountable morally. And that's basically the argument that Niebuhr makes. But I highly recommend that book. You have to get past the fact that Niebuhr was writing 80 years ago or so. So the language, and he's obviously dealing with different political and societal issues, but the basic point of the book still holds true. And it plays into his critique actually of Billy Graham as well. All right. Seeing how I didn't give you all the last question, we're not gonna address it, but I'll just put it out there. Don't forget your papers on human condition and the nature of sin are due on Thursday. So the last question that I dropped off are, what are the three ways humanity is made new in the image in and through Christ, according to Migliore? And so he deals with that in the last couple pages of this chapter. And so just make sure you read that, because that will sort of bring your paper that you're going to do for Thursday to full circle. Any questions?
So for Thursday or for the paper specifically, the human condition and sin. So the first page is kind of how Migliore describes it, I guess.
Yeah.
Then the second is kind of how we would.
Yeah.
So in terms of that, would we talk about sin with humans, or would we try to be like, okay, so it's original sin, forgiveness and grace, and then being made new, or like how deep do you want us to go, or
Yeah.
like what do you want us specifically to cover?
Okay, that's a great question, because each one of those could be a multi-page paper, right? So just as you've done in the first page, summarize Migliore and what he covers here in chapter 6. And then for your part of it, I think what is best is how you would define sin. So Migliore basically defines sin as alienation, right? Alienation from God, and then alienation from human beings, one another. That's basically how Migliore defines sin. Uh, so if you want to condense everything that he's said in these multiple pages, his definition of sin is alienation. Either and that's in that two-dimensional, the vertical alienation from God and the horizontal alienation from humans. And then he talks about what can create that alienation, right? So if you reject God's grace, that can create alienation with God. If you dominate or are passive between humans, that can create alienation there, the sin of pride or the sin of passivity. That can create alienation between human beings. And then finally, if you want to deal with original sin, you can. I think it's important to understand the concept, because if you go to graduate school, and study theology, this is still going to be a hotly debated topic, even though most people today have the kind of view of original sin that Migliore does. It's still a foundational concept, but I don't know in your paper if it's necessary to talk about it. And then how does Christ reconcile that? How does Christ fill the chasm or the void of that alienation? That would be so. But you might not see sin as alienation. So if you don't see sin as alienation, then how do you see it? And then how does Christ play a role in correcting or fixing the problem of sin, right? Or making the human condition better? Does that make sense? So really in your page, tell me how you define sin. Tell me how you see the human condition currently based on how you define sin. And then how does Christ come to reconcile the problem of that alienation or split between God and human beings? All right. And then for us, for this class, what's next? Hold on a second, because all right. Wait. All right, for you all to read. Okay, so chapter 8, the person and work of Christ. That's what you'll start reading for Thursday. So work on your papers and start reading chapter 8, the person and work of Christ. All right, take care, everyone. I'll see you all on Thursday. And Stephanie, hopefully, let me know if you're going to be here tomorrow or if we need to do Zoom. And I'll send you later today the chapters for Ezekiel to read. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.